Okay, good afternoon and welcome to this talk on mapping and identifying biodiversity. Good afternoon and welcome as well to all of those who haven't yet been to the Oxford Martin School. We are a home within the university for unconventional and interdisciplinary thinking on a host of issues, ranging from the future of food to the future of human rights, nanotechnology, and rethinking economics. But this afternoon we're going to be talking about biodiversity. We have four speakers. We have Kathy Willis, who is our founding director of the Biodiversity Institute. She's also the co-director of our Oxford Martin programme on resource stewardship. But she spends 4 days a week now as Director of Science at Kew Gardens. We're going to hear from Peter Long, James Martin Fellow, excuse me, at the Biodiversity Institute, Timos Papadopoulos and Tom Nixon. Excuse me. I'm going to ask Kathy to start, and we're going to hear from people in that order, with Kathy then chairing the Q&A afterwards. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the introduction. So it's a great pleasure to be here because the Biodiversity Institute was set up as one of the Oxford Martin School institutes 4 years ago now. And one of the key areas that we were looking to develop as part of this institute was the interdisciplinary work to do merging biodiversity and technologies to try and come out with new methods for both measuring and identifying key areas of biodiversity globally. But first of all, what do we mean by biodiversity? It's one of those phrases that's used an awful lot. In fact, when I started the job 4 years ago, the BBC produced a report where 80% of the UK population thought biodiversity was a washing powder. So what we have here, biodiversity can go from the individual species to the communities, to the populations, to the landscapes, and also right the way down to genetic diversity. But there are a number of global challenges that we're all facing in many aspects, both for food but also for biodiversity. And I just very briefly want to give an overview or a very quick introduction to these, because then that's to frame the work that we've been doing in order to identify and map biodiversity. The first one, clearly, as we all know, and looking out the window, pouring with rain again, is the global challenge being faced by climate change and its impact on biodiversity. Both the increase in carbon dioxide, a primary resource for plants. So what's that doing to our distribution of biodiversity? But also the large increase in variability of climate events is very serious. But then we've got also an increasing demand on land. So it's not just a demand related to population growth, that in the next 30 to 50 years we're going to be up to the 9 billion mark, but also the change in diet. As people become wealthier, then they tend to move to a more meat-based diet. So if we look at China, for example, and this is livestock consumption in the last 30 years, you'll see there's been a very large increase in the amount of meat being eaten, and that in itself puts a huge impact on land. And then we've got another conflict coming through right now. So when we're trying to deal with climate change, one of our solutions are biofuels. But where do we plant those biofuels? Well, we plant those biofuels in the areas that are very, very good for plant growth and for biodiversity in general, which unfortunately also is important for crops, for food stocks, and also they're some of the most important areas for biodiversity globally. This is a very sort of political slide that I got off the web, but I think it makes the point very clearly that there's an awful lot of conflict going on right now about this idea of do we use land for biodiversity, do we use land for food, or do we use land for fuel? But I think for me, this is one of the biggest problems. One that's often not mentioned is that protected land only accounts for 12% of the terrestrial surface and less than 1% of the oceans. So 88% of our land is basically the Wild West. It's free for conversion from biodiverse land to other uses. And so while we can spend a lot of time worrying about where are the hottest spots for biodiversity, we also need to be thinking about that remaining 88%, which parts of those landscape are good or bad for biodiversity. So you wouldn't be wrong in thinking that the story or the line you often see for biodiversity is very gloomy, that despite progress over the last 20 years, there is a large decline in global biodiversity, and this is of concern to many, particularly to conservation biologists. But I think if you ask a number of people, they would say, and particularly politicians, I have to say, having to answer this question myself several times, why should I worry about biodiversity? Is this a luxury we can ill afford now? In fact, we have so many other pressing issues on our land that biodiversity has to come at the bottom of the list. Interestingly, the same question was asked of businesses. This was a McKinsey Global Survey report in 2010. And up to 65% did think that biodiversity was important for their business. Now, there's two sides to this. The first is they thought it's important because when they damage it and get it wrong, like the oil spills, then that has a huge impact on their business, both reputationally, but also in terms of their share, their stock prices. But many of them now see biodiversity as important for the businesses because of the ecosystem services it provides for their business. So if we just look at several of these, so clearly the one that most people immediately link in with biodiversity would be the development of drugs, but also carbon trading has obviously really increased in the last 10 to 15 years. And not forgetting, of course, the cultural services provided by biodiversity, be it in the UK, which in fact would be an incredibly non-biodiverse landscape, this one, right the way through to ecotourism, going to these very important biodiverse areas, for example, in East Africa. So there's been a real shift in the way that we think about biodiversity in the last 5 years or so, and this all comes under this sort of natural capital, the ecosystem service framework. So if you were originally looking at this as a biodiversity biologist, you would say probably that this is the most biodiverse part of the landscape. But if you think of it in terms of its ecosystem services, the provisions it provides for human well-being, then you would start off with the bottom. This bottom part here would be an important landscape for provisioning services. That's where you'd want to be placing your fuels, the various biofuels and crops down there. But this tree here, in fact, will be very important on this landscape for pollinators, for habitat foraging for pollinators. So that is a supporting ecosystem service. You've then got your regulating services here, which is your carbon drawdown of these trees. And finally, at the top here, it looks like an almost non-biodiverse landscape, is important for your cultural services, particularly your walking, your climbing, and also your sacred sites. Just to give you two examples before we move on to biodiverse technologies. So how do you then value this? Well, this is, for example, this is a very old example, but this is the New York City's water supply, which is down here, and yet it's fed from these two watersheds further upstream. Very large watersheds, many people liked living there, more and more houses were built, more and more trees were cut down, to the point where they had to start to think about how much clean water was coming in here and how much the value of these trees for providing the clean water down here in terms of their filtering of the soils. When they costed it, they realised that to build a water filtration facility would cost between 2 to 6 billion, and annual round costs are around 300 million. Whereas if you restore the nature and basically the ecosystem services provided by the trees, it was a considerably cheaper and also a sustainable option. And what happened in this case was that the New York State bought up much of this forest and maintained the ecosystem services. On your very local scale, when they calculated the importance of pollinators on this landscape for smallhold farmers in Costa Rica, what they found was, in fact, that by having your bees and maintaining your bees on that landscape, it improved your coffee by 20%. And actually, these services, you could value them around $60,000 for one Costa Rica farm a year, and that's a smallholders. So given those sorts of ways of thinking of biodiversity, the next key question then, if we accept that biodiversity is a very important thing to try and conserve, is what tools are there available for determining the important parts of the landscape to preserve and conserve for these important features of biodiversity. And this point was put to me very clearly when I originally did some work for Statoil, the Norwegian oil company, who asked a very good question. They said, where can we damage? Now that, as a conservation biologist, that was a slightly alarming question to be asked, because the first thing I wanted to say was, well, nowhere. But they were being very truthful. They were saying, we know that where our facility, where we place it in a particular area, will, depending on where we put our footprint, depends on how much damage we do. Yet all of the areas that they're working in are outside of the protected areas. So effectively, they can damage anywhere they like within the rules of the local government. So that really got me going about where are the knowledge gaps for mapping biodiversity. Well, first of all, we still have a very poor understanding of species distribution in time and space. We have a poor understanding of the location of biodiverse landscapes, important for ecosystem services, particularly beyond protected areas. But also, where are the landscapes that contain less favourable biodiversity? It's a question we don't often ask. And what do we mean by less favourable? We're going to have an example this afternoon about mosquito distributions. How do we map mosquito distributions and do something about it? And the final point is, I think it's very easy as an academic, especially working here, to sort of sit in your ivory tower, develop these tools and technologies that are really intense. They're very, very high level of maths and skills required to get the output. But we must remember that the people using these tools, more often than not, will be the landowners, and their own skill sets will be incredibly limited, and their time will be very limited as well. There's an estimation done recently, for example, which demonstrated that to get one data point out of one of the GIS tools for calculating ecosystem services took 300 hours of skilled GIS time. Now, nobody is going to pay that to get the basic data on biodiversity out of a system. So where have we got to? Well, this is when we used to map biodiversity, and I certainly remember doing this. You had your jam jar, you had your fishing net, and if you're lucky, you had a calculator. But now we have smartphones. Clearly, so where are the tools and technologies for starting to map landscapes? And I think for me, one of the most encouraging parts of much of this is how widespread your smartphones and your tools and technologies are. And also we have crowdsourcing, three very important things to consider. So this afternoon, I want to give some, and I've got three people from the Biodiversity Institute and also the Machine Learning Research Group. This was a collaboration as part of the Biodiversity Institute. It's ongoing research, but I thought the best way to describe the sorts of tools and technologies that we've been developing is to get the people involved in the development to stand up and talk about them, to give you some idea about the potential and what we've done so far. So we've got three tools being discussed this afternoon. First of all, Peter Long, who's a James Martin Fellow over in zoology, is going to be talking about work we've been doing on the local ecological footprinting tool. Then Timos Papadopoulos will talk about the work we've been doing to develop a smartphone app to identify birds through their song. And taking that further, Tom Nixon is then going to talk about how we're developing that even further to understand and be able to map mosquito distributions using the smartphone. So I'm going to start off with Peter, and then they'll follow on from each other, and then I'll sum up at the end. Peter.
Well, thank you, Kathy, and it's a real pleasure to speak to you about the what we've been doing. So this tool I'm about to talk to you about was motivated by this question that Statoil posed to us, and they're very helpful in posing a really good question. I hope to show that what we've built to satisfy their requirement is actually a much wider usefulness potential than just helping one multinational company address their environmental risk mitigation. So they asked us that. I'll try using this pointer instead. And I want to talk to you about what we did. So we had a workshop with them, and we essentially established to the end users that in order to help businesses make streamlined decisions about land, they needed a simple, easy-to-use, web-based tool that even executives can get their head around, that would be simple to use, yet have a lot of complexity and sophistication behind the scenes. So we wanted to use the very best available data that we could select from the best data providers and the best scientific consensus about the best published algorithms that could be used to map various features of the environment. And our stakeholders told us they wanted to know something about endangered species, about the configuration of landscapes, about biodiversity itself, and about the resilience of environments to climate change and environmental perturbations. So we tried to take these requirements and build something useful. And this is what we built. It's a website, essentially. And I'm going to go out of the presentation now and just try and demonstrate to you how that works. So this, by the way, is online. It's launched. It's free of charge. You can go and visit this website and try it out, run an analysis. So first of all, we go to Oh yes, me. There we go. So this is the Biodiversity Institute website, and this is the page that describes the left tool, and this is just some preamble to describe what the tool does, and you can access the papers we published about it. But to have a go, you just click on the go to the tool link. Anyone can create an account. If you're coming here for the first time, you just click the new account button, specify, put your email address in and choose a password. But I'm going to log in as me just to show you how it works. So this is the screen you see when you first come to the tool as a user. You can do two things from here. You can click on the View Analyses, the black button, to see all the previous questions you've asked about ecological value and get results. But if you're here for the first time, you click on the New Analysis button, which is here. And this is the interface. It's a sort of slippy map. You can pan and zoom it. You can toggle between a sort of map view and a satellite view. It can search by place name, so if you type in Oxford here, for example, it will send to the map. If you know a particular place in the world you're interested in and you have bounding coordinates, you can type them in these squares here. Would anyone like to shout out a place in the world, maybe a holiday destination, somewhere you're familiar with, and I can show you how you'd run a left analysis hypothetically? Hawaii, thanks, Gerard. Let's do it. So imagine I don't know where Hawaii is. I can just type it in the place name, Hawaii, United States, and it should center to the big island. That's nice. So the whole, let's do one of the islands, or let's suppose just a small area to make it go fast. Let's suppose, for the sake of argument, you're a mining company or a farmer, and you want to know how relatively important the landscape is. Let's draw a box just like that. Let's go Hawaii, and I'm going to push go. And it really is as easy as that. So now, this is a list of all the analyses I've ever done before. And you can see some of them are completed. The one that I've just pushed go to for Hawaii has just been submitted. And in a few seconds, it should hopefully be noticed by our server room. And it will start processing. And maybe in a few minutes' time, I'll come back and see how that's got on. But I'll go back to the presentation. And where's it gone? So here we are. So I don't want to talk in any great detail about the computer science behind how this is actually accomplished. I mean, this is a big collaboration. Lots of people in our research group have been involved in writing the algorithms and setting up the technology in a collaboration with computer science to actually build the infrastructure. But essentially, you push go on the website, advanced magic occurs, and a result comes out. And the way it basically works is that a series of servers in the zoology department are right now working on that bounding box that I just entered. And they've gone away and queried lots of pre-stored, high-quality, moderate resolution, 300-meter resolution global data sets about things like elevation and land cover classes. And it's getting processed on the fly with various algorithms. And we're generating a PDF report, a sort of 20-page report, which is basically a glorified mail merge. It's a template where we describe what's happening, and then styled maps get generated, custom generated for each location, and pasted into the report. So I'll show you basically what the kinds of things you see in a report are. That's roughly what it looks like somewhere in Oxford. This is a case study location in Madagascar where I do a long-term biodiversity monitoring program. And if you were to put a query in for that site, this is one of the first maps you'd see. It's a land cover classification. It just shows basically that there's some savannas, some forests, some mangroves, some open water and some urban areas. And that's just to provide some basic context. The next thing you do is drawing directly on the pixels of individual types of different land cover in the previous map. We ask, how big is the patch of the same kind of habitat class, grassland or forest, for example, that each bit of land belongs to? So this large red area here, the dark red area, is showing a large contiguous patch of a savanna, whereas the blue areas are a more fragmented, small agricultural landscape. So all else being equal, this map is saying that if you want to cause damage to the environment, it's better to place it in the already fragmented area rather than the large, intact, good area. A feature we're really proud of this tool is the ability to query a global data set of biodiversity records. It's something called the Global Biodiversity Information Facility based in Copenhagen. And it's essentially a set of 300 million records of observations of animals and plants in particular places with Latin names attached. So they could be field biodiversity observations or museum records that have been collected. And we know where they came from and when they were collected. So if you put a query into left, the red box, we buffer it by 300 kilometres, and we find all the areas of land that are ecologically similar, the same kind of ecoregions. So the white polygon, for example, here is the western Madagascar dry forest ecoregion, whereas the grey area is a very dissimilar tropical rainforest that we don't want to consider in this analysis. So we find all the relevant biodiversity records. You can see we found about 6,000 here, which is fairly standard. And additional to those records, which you get presented to you in the report as a checklist of, sort of Latin names and some files of records, we have lots of data about environmental variables, things like elevation, rainfall, and soils. And we can use that sparse records with continuous data to fit various kinds of models. So we make distribution models, for example, to look at endangered species. And that's what we're doing here. So when a query comes in, we ask, well, which country is this in and which countries is it in? We then query the IUCN red list of critically endangered, and globally vulnerable and near-threatened species that live in that country, find all the records for that set of species, model the distributions, test whether the fitted models accurately worked or not, and then harden them to areas which are suitable for a particular endangered species and not suitable. And we do that for potentially 200 or many, many species, and then add them all together. So what the map you're seeing here is a hotspot type map of the relative numbers of globally threatened terrestrial vertebrates and plant species which are potentially present. So it's not absolutely certain that, if you were to survey a particular location, you'd find exactly 25, but this is the relative pattern. So the forest, where I work, very pleasingly comes out as a relatively important area in this landscape, and the sort of more degraded savanna down here, relatively less important. Beta diversity is another way of getting at biodiversity. It's a slightly tricky concept. I'm not sure if you can imagine walking up a mountain or basically traversing some ecological gradient. And you might go bird watching and see one bundle of species at one end of the gradient. At low elevation, you might see certain bird species. As you walk a short distance, say a kilometre, but change the environmental parameters quite a lot by going uphill where it's rainier, for example, you might see the species turn over completely and you get a different set. By taking those biodiversity records and the environmental variables, we can fit something called a generalized dissimilarity model to characterize that. So red areas here are places of rapid turnover, rapid ecological change, and high heterogeneity in the features, the species present. Whereas the sort of yellowy green areas are places which are fairly homogeneous and by this metric, less valuable. So if you go for a walk there, you'd see one bunch of plant species and you go 4 kilometers away and it's still much the same. So again, this is another way of informing decisions and choosing where to avoid. We also have elevation models, and we know how much upslope contributing area there is and whether a stream channel would likely flow. And this is important because stream channels, which we identify here in red, are important dispersal routes. So for example, seeds get dispersed down rivers, and many animals like insects and mammals and birds follow stream channels as dispersion pass through landscapes. So we try and figure out where they are. At a slightly larger scale, we also want to show the global context for sites by taking polygons describing the migratory flyways, mostly of migratory birds, but also the migration routes used by terrestrial migratory mammals and a few turtle species in the marine area, to find out how many different migratory species are potentially passing through a location. And here you're seeing it's a sort of coastal landscape, but quite a small area, so this is perhaps not the most informative tool. A final component of the tool is looking at vegetation resilience. Now, we're currently working on a very much refined algorithm for resilience, but in the tool at present, what we do is we consider each vegetation type separately, so considering the forest and then the grasslands and so on. We ask, where are the locations in the landscape which, among that class, maintain the highest productivity in a given year, but were most water stressed? So where are the trees which stayed green and continued photosynthesis despite being most water stressed? And those are locations we suspect are of very valuable locally adaptive vegetation that really shouldn't be disturbed if it can possibly be helped. So the red areas are the most important. In this particular context, they're mostly mangroves, and the blue areas are less important. So for a decision maker's perspective, we've basically had 5 rather complementary different ways of looking at ecological value: the endangered species, the beta diversity, 2 measures of connectivity, and the vegetation resilience. And they're essentially each voting for why an area might be important. And by producing a summary ecological value map, we normalise those things and combine them. And basically places that always come out blue are, by all these metrics, the relatively least important areas in the landscape, where if you must have a copper mine or a big biofuels plantation, that would be we suggest the least damaging place to put it. But the red areas really are rather critical, and if they can be avoided, and if businesses have a a scalable, easy-to-use tool to help them make that decision, we think that's good. So people look at this, and the feedback from organisations that have tried it is generally quite positive, that they seem to think it sort of works, it's fairly slick. And it looks compelling, but can we have confidence that the data behind these maps is actually reliable? And so people say, well, how accurate really is this compared to good quality data? And it's fortunate that we have data sets from large-scale, landscape-scale, multi-taxa, long-term biodiversity surveys of a rainforest and dry forests around the world that we can use to validate left. This is Honduras and this is Madagascar. So we can run a left analysis up here on the left-hand side, and then using data we haven't submitted to GBIF, run another analysis using the same algorithms to try and find the pattern you get with a vastly greater biodiversity data set. We've used various methods to characterize how well left performs against this higher quality validation data. And generally it comes out very well. This is beta diversity. There's a small artifact of a city here. This is beta diversity in a mountain system in Honduras, left on the left-hand side, and our field data on the right-hand side. And these are very encouraging results, and they seem to satisfy potential users that they can have some confidence in left as a pre-planning tool. So the argument I'd like to make to you really is that these kinds of decision support tools have great potential. So potentially any spatial data could be used. We can assimilate new spatial data. You can change the algorithms to achieve different things. You can change the spatial resolution and the time and develop custom tools for different applications. And that's exactly what we're doing with Left2. Left2 is exactly the same as Left, except it's much more data hungry. It works at a very much finer spatial resolution. And we hope to produce that towards the end of this year. We're also building tools for ecosystem service characterization using the same sort of computing platforms. And this is the kind of thing that you get out. This is a high-resolution natural colour visualization of Oxford, so you can see things like White Woods and the Farmwell Reservoir in the city and the oilfield rapes fields. So that's very much work in progress. But it's been a real pleasure to tell you about Left. So now I'll pass on to Timos to tell you about a different project entirely. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Peter. This is a short presentation about the BioSound project, and more particularly about birdsong automatic recognition. I'm going to briefly talk about our project and about automatic bird recognition, our specific approach to it, and I'll briefly describe the technical side of, not the technical side, but the main angle of the classifier that we're using and the advantages that we believe it has. And then I'll go on to some results, first from a European bird recordings database, and then from our own backyard in the university parks that we did rather recently. And I'm going to conclude by saying what we plan to do in the near future. So this is a project that's hosted by the Biodiversity Institute, and it's funded by the Oxford Martin School. Something that we're very grateful for. It's a collaboration between the Department of Zoology and the Machine Learning Research Group. And the overarching objective is to use smartphone-related technologies to leverage the fact that this is a so widespread technology in our days, to use crowdsourcing infrastructures and citizen science networks in order to address questions in biodiversity monitoring and in computational bioacoustics. What I'll be talking about will be mainly focused on birdsong recognition. This is a rather confusing map of the overarching plan of what we intend to do. What I'll be talking about will be mainly focused here, and to be a bit more specific, when we're trying to recognize the species of a bird from a recording, we have to keep a few things in mind. First of all, I should say that I'm not a zoologist. I'm an electrical engineer. I'm in signal processing. So these things I learn as I go in the project, but it's among the main things that you have to keep in mind when you're trying to do what we're trying to do. There's many birds around. It's one of the most populated vertebrate land animals. One thing, there's around 40,000 species of birds that can sing, and many non-singing birds produce other kinds of calls that allow us to identify them from recordings. In the UK, we have in excess of 250 species occurring regularly, and most of them are associated with distinctive calls or songs. There's a long list of similarities between birdsong and human speech, and the reason I'm putting that up is that a large part of the work so far in automatic birdsong recognition has relied on tools that we largely use in speech recognition, but there's quite a few dissimilarities also. I'm going to just pinpoint the more important ones. Birdsong is not a language. Even though it resembles language in many aspects, it has syllables. We can identify syllables and segments like phrases. It doesn't necessarily carry meaning, and even if it did, we don't know that meaning. We don't have a grammar or a syntax for it. So using this type of approach, where we try to map recordings to syllables or phrases, is in many aspects a very limited approach, especially if we want to cover 1,000 of different species for which we don't have this kind of grammar. So just to repeat on that, since this area of research started a few decades ago, it moved through a stage where lots of human speech processing techniques were being used, and now it moves in an area where we're using more generative probabilistic models for it. I'm having a few papers here, but I'm not going to go into them. Just some of them are what classifiers we're using for our work, and I'm just putting them here for reference. What I wanted to stress is that most of these works present results that consider 10 or fewer species. We're interested, as I showed before, in classifying among hundreds of different species, so that's one aspect. And most of them rely on some sort of manual or semi-automatic syllable segmentation, where an expert have to listen to the recording and identify little characteristic syllables for each species, according to which then classification can be applied. We want to avoid that, because that's completely impractical when you have, again, hundreds of species and hundreds of recordings. So this is just a pictorial example of how some previous works have, tried to make this type of classification of automatic speech birdsong recognition. For specific species, you have a repertoire, a grammar of syllables on the basis of which you can classify, but this is only for very few species. Whereas our goal is to be able to do that for a much larger number. So we're following a more generic approach in which we don't rely on identifying syllables. We just take our audio recording and use it as what we call a bag of frames. I'm not going to go into many of the details of how this is done. This is just to show this is a typical tool, spectrogram, where you have a series of Fourier transforms of your input signal, and you just identify very simple features for each one of them, and then you create histograms, which is counts of appearances of each of these pair of numbers. So you have a two-dimensional histogram, and effectively each recording is a shape like that, is a histogram like that. And by comparing histograms and by measuring the distance between different types of histograms, you can infer whether this recording comes from this or the other species. I'm not going to go into many of the details, just going to show some results, and I'm happy to answer questions to anybody that would like to ask. We applied this approach to a database of recordings that this is slightly out of date now. It currently has around 130 species and in excess of 5,000 recordings, and classified these recordings on the basis of the algorithm that I briefly presented before. In this example, we had 120 classes, 120 different species, and this is a number of choices that we allowed the classifier to have. In the first try, the classifier got it right around 55% of the time. chance would allow 1 over 121 a correct performance here. And as we increase the number of chances, obviously you go higher up in performance. When you correct for chance, this is just subtracting chance from the result. One thing to stress here is that this is a slightly non-realistic result. In the next few slides, I'm going to show more realistic performance. This allows the classifier to tell which species a recording came from using recordings from the same individual, from the same bird. You cannot expect to have that in reality. When you disallow that, you get slightly worse performance, and again, corrected for chance. This is the performance you get. So this practically means that if you don't have recordings from the same individual, you would get it right around 35% of the time 35% of times in the first try, and then you would very slowly increase your performance as you give it more tries. Now, there's a number of, I'm not going to go in detail in that. I just put it up there because this is most of the work we're doing. There's a number of parameters you have to work on with the classifier to make it work better. This was just, the results I showed were the ones you get with the classifier that's the least computationally expensive. So since we want these when it's finalized to run on a mobile phone, we want it to be computationally cheap. So the results I just showed are the cheapest computationally cheapest version of all these parameters. But to just show a little bit of a more realistic example, we went around just our backyard, as I said, the university parks. We did it with Dr. Paul Jepson, and who knows a little bit more about birds than I do. And he was able to tell me what it was that we were recording as we were walking around. We actually recorded vocalizations from these 11 species. Oops, sorry. And, I had as we were walking around on a mobile, and I was just keeping notes of what we were recording. So, for example, we had just a snippet, something like that.
That was blackbird alarm call.
So that was Paul just telling me what it was. So by trying to use the recordings we have from the database of European birds, mainly from Germany, that included blackbird recordings, to classify this snippet, which was what we recorded in the university parks, we got it. It was the 8th out of the 121 options. And when you restrict your options to the 11 that you expect to hear around the university parks at this time of year, at this time of the day, and so on, it was the 2nd option. So, you have to keep in mind that this is a completely independent, it was a very bad recording, as you could hear, on my mobile, and it was completely independent of the training set we had. So that's not a very bad result. Again, the same, Paul telling me what it is.
Great tip.
So, asking the classifier what this is. It came up 10th and first out of 11 when you restrict your data set. In what you locally expect to encounter. And finally, trying to classify that, you get it 7th or 1st out of the 11. So this is quite encouraging, because one thing you have to keep in mind is what you see as the performance of the classifier in a simulated scenario. You cannot expect to get that in the real world. These are real world recordings, completely disassociated from the training set, and The performance is not discouraging at all. So, the key points, it is possible to recognize species among hundreds of candidate species without having an expert segmenting syllables for you. It works with field recordings that are not necessarily very good quality, so that's encouraging. Now, at the current stage, we're still relying on somebody to tell the classifier what to classify. So you have to tell the classifier, classify this, and not Paul saying it is a blackbird, for example. So that's something we're currently working on. Try to automatically identify what is likely to be bird song, and then classify that, rather than noise or a bus going by or whatever. And obviously, as I showed, the performance improves if you narrow down the number of classes you're looking by. And on a smartphone, this is very easy to do because you know exactly where you are, what time of the day it is, what time of the year it is. And if you have, as we do have, distributions of birds, of species around a certain area, around a certain time of the year and day and so on, you can introduce that as a prior. And that's what we're currently working on. As I said, we're currently working on an online update of the features. So as you go around, you can tell that there's no point classifying something here because there's no bird song here. You have a measure of that. And one way of trying to do that is with a latent terrestrial allocation type classifier that I'm not going to go into details here, but I'm just putting it up because it's what we're working on. Another thing we're working on is try to associate these distances, audio distances, with phylogenetic distances. So we're building trees of distances between the audio characteristics and see if that corresponds to anything that has to do with phylogeny. I don't have any results on that yet, but it's something we're working on. And and also, as I briefly spoke about it, we're trying to get a coarser idea of, is this recording something that could have birdsong in it? Is there a point in classifying it or not? And we're using a number of techniques, mainly from using information retrieval applications here, but again, I'm not going to go into detail about that. So this wraps up what I had to say, and I'll pass on to Tom. Thanks.
Hello. Mosquito detection on a budget. I'm Tom, I'm from the Machine Learning Research Group, and mosquitoes are, in general, not very nice. They're annoying, they make you itch, and 2 species of them can give you malaria or dengue fever, neither of which is a particularly pleasant disease to have, and is relatively likely to kill you or incapacitate you. And from a purely economic point of view, that's quite expensive. So, the bias in this talk is going to be that killing mosquitoes is not a bad thing to do. And it feels a bit strange being in a biodiversity lecture and saying that, but I don't feel too bad about it, because prevention is better than cure. So, we want to identify and to catch mosquitoes. There are reasons for this. Killing them off is quite expensive and dangerous because we need to use insecticides or whatever other kind of method you want to use. We also want to know where they are. As Kathy said, we want to be able to map their distribution. So governments can target their eradications in a specific place, or we can get medical supplies to the places where the dangerous mosquitoes are before they start to infect people. We need some kind of fingerprint to actually identify the mosquitoes that carry the diseases and separate them from the ones that don't carry disease and are just irritating. A good fingerprint might be the horrible mosquito noise. Anyone who hears that knows it's a mosquito. You might know what species, you might not know what species it is, but you do know it's a mosquito. So hearing that makes us think that we might be able to find a fingerprint, an acoustic fingerprint similar to how Timos is doing with birds, to find out what species of mosquito we're listening to. So I've got here 3 recordings of different species of mosquitoes. These were given to me by Timos. I'm not quite sure how they're taken, but it was similar to putting a dictaphone in a box full of mosquitoes. So they're not the most realistic of recordings, but they're a good start. So this is Aedes aegypti, and that's the one that carries dengue fever, I believe, and yellow fever. Okay, and this is Anopheles ferrati, which is malaria and one of the ones that carries malaria, as well as other ones, I'm sure. So it's possibly a bit deeper? Not sure. And then there's Culex, that one. I'm not quite sure what this carries. I think this one might be one of the merely irritating rather than dangerous ones. So again. Yeah. Right. We could sort of hear a difference between those, but having a human be there to attempt to vaguely separate them is expensive and also stupid, because kind of we want to stop people from being endangered by them rather than having people there to classify. So we want to use computers or cheap phones or machines to do it for us. And we'll do that with a Fourier transform to look at the instantaneous signal. And I've used Pink Floyd's prism here to show how, similar to how white light we can split into many colors, we can split a audio recording into the frequencies. And so in the bottom right, we've got the frequencies of those three clips that I played you. And so you can see that Anopheles here, which we thought was deeper, indeed, the peak here is a bit deeper. And then Culex, which is the green one, which is this peak, for example. Yeah, I don't know, I'm slightly colorblind, so you'll have to just agree with me on this one. Poor choice of colors, my apologies. But you can see that there is a noticeable difference between the frequency spectrums. So what we did, we used a really classic machine learning tool that I had on my computer, a support vector machine. What this does is it says to the computer, draw a line between these two classes of things in a way that separates them in the best way possible. So I've got a really simple demonstration on the right, and that's just in two-dimensional space separating between class 1 and class 2. It draws a line right down the middle. We can do the same thing with each of the frequencies in this Fourier transform. We can say, this is an example of Anopheles, this is an example of Aedes, draw a line between them. And then whenever we have a new recording of Aedes or Anopheles, the support vector machine will give us its best guess onto which side of the line that those fall. And from those three recordings, by separating them and learning on half of them and testing on half of them, we got about 90% accuracy. So that's quite encouraging. But as I say, these were recorded in boxes without background noise. So there's quite a lot more development needed. Southampton University, who under my funding body I have a lot of contact with, they've done a thing called the cicada detector to try and detect the New Forest cicada. It's a phone application, and Alex Rogers, who I think is leading it, also has worked on making a £2 integrated circuit version, which is really cool. So this is a video of that working. No, it isn't. This is a video of that working. So you can hear this noise and the light lights up. Proof of it working, at least. So yeah, this is very good. The downside of this is that the cicada makes a much more easy to classify noise than mosquitoes do. It's a very loud signal at around 14 kilohertz. So it is quite easy to do, whereas what we're looking at doing here is a lot harder. But if we can pull it off, then either through using smartphones or through using these £2 circuits, we could do automated insecticide dispensers that act almost like smoke alarms. They hear a mosquito, they release a small puff of insecticide because that implies that there are more mosquitoes in the room, rather than having to constantly go around spraying your house with DEET. Cattle tags or bird tags with GPS tracking, we can make really cheap, really low power tags that just record the GPS satellite data, which we can then crunch offline when we collect the birds or collect the cows, and then get a very good, very wide-ranging map of the sort of population centres of mosquitoes. a detector alarm for people's mobile phones. If you have your mobile phone with you, it buzzes in your pocket and lets you know that there's possibly a dangerous mosquito around. And then you can either alert the authorities or run away, up to your choice. And then finally, so I presented a talk similar to this to my research group a few weeks ago. And one idea that came up was a laser-based mosquito hunter. And it listens out for the mosquito and then pew, and shoots it. So, you know, that's possibly quite dangerous and impractical, but the rest of them are doable and would be very interesting. So future work, as I say, we can classify mosquitoes with clean recordings on my very expensive computer. We need to do a lot more work to classify with real-world recordings on a £1.50 cattle tag, but we've made the first steps, and yeah, as I say, I think it is quite possible.
So thank you very much to all three of you for, I hope that's given you some ideas about where we're going. I put this up as a joke, but I think in some ways this really it typifies where we are aiming to move to, not to have zebras on motorbikes, but certainly to use technologies in an intelligent way in order to map and to map and understand the big challenges that we're currently facing in terms of global biodiversity loss, and also to determine those areas where we can damage and those things that we do want to get rid of. So I want to sort of, and as you can hear from the talk today, it's both sides of that biodiversity debate that I think we should be looking at. And the Oxford Martin School has been a fantastic facilitator in that because it's enabled the expertise from computer sciences, zoology, plant sciences, geography, and the humanities to come together and to start to think beyond the box. So none of us are in our own comfort zone. As Timos said, he is a computer engineer, and yet he is based in the zoology department now. That's the future of this sort of work, and that's where we need to go to, I think, to really get these tools out into the marketplace, and in order to give them to the stakeholders, be it the landowner or the medic, to be able to map biodiversity in time and space. So thank you very much for your attention, and we can now take some questions. Thank you. So are there, I have a microphone here. We have the three speakers that'd like to come up the front. And we have a microphone in the audience. So are there any questions?
Thank you for that. I thought the left tool sounded amazing. I didn't know about it before. But I'd like to ask about how you normalize the data. As in the obvious problem, what do you do about one interesting rare species compared to more interesting, less rare species? And the final question, there's always an annoying thing when you develop an amazing tool that someone asks for something extra. But I do a lot of work in India, and there some form of monetary value would always be a useful persuasive technique. And I don't know if there's any way or thoughts about adding a kind of a monetizing factor to the tool.
So perhaps I should take that question. To do the last part first, we're very interested in physically characterizing the state of the environment and presenting that data to people in such a way that would be possible for economists, if they wanted to take that information and run with it and fit economic models based on a much better, more detailed characterization of the real natural environment. So it's a very good question. Potentially people should do it, but it's not quite what we're doing. The question about left, obviously people look at this through lots of different lenses, and that you can't be all things to all people simultaneously. It's designed so that you can drill down into the data and get more details. So we present a very broad picture in the maps, but then you can drill down and get the real information. So in the case that you're interested in one particular specific endangered species, you get a PDF map, a report at the end, but you also get a zip file that's emailed to you. And if you go into there, you'll find lots and lots of text files that will let you find all the individual results for the species. You'll get all the records of all the different endangered species. So if, for example, in India, you're particularly interested in tigers, for example, they would be contributing a little bit to the hotspots of endangered species map. If you wanted to map all the tiger records for India, you could do so very simply by inspecting the more detailed data you get from the map. You asked about normalization. In the summary ecological value map, all individual component maps are first individually normalized using z-scores. So you map how many standard deviations away above or below the mean within that study area the feature is, and then they get aggregated together to give you a map where each individual component counts equally. Some people find the SEV map very useful, some as a sort of guide to their thinking, some more or less ignore it and consider each individual map one at a time.
Question here.
I've got a left question as well, left field question maybe. I am also interested about the ecosystem service direction that you're going in, and I guess it's quite a challenge to pull together the right data sets and the right combinations in a whole system to be able to provide a way of advising people around ecosystem services. I wondered what you're seeing as the main challenges or the main difficulties that you're having to work on when you start to add in, you know, water and even tourism and leisure services. It seems to be a very complicated picture that you have to try and paint. What are the main issues there?
Well, you're quite right. I mean, it's a formidable challenge to accurately map lots of different ecosystem services in a way that's acceptable to lots of stakeholders. The argument I make is that our fundamental infrastructure for assimilating the very best quality data about the state of the environment, using day-to-day satellite data to know about land cover change, for example, and elevation models, is a really helpful start. We're also being very innovative in asking not just what data exists on the shelf, but what data in principle could we caused to come into being by appropriate algorithms and data harvesting tools. So we're building our basic data infrastructure processing technologies, and we think the general way of presenting the maps is helpful. But we're also working really, really hard on assembling, like pre-assembling the best quality data about the environment and developing algorithms. And we have a project funded by the European Commission that's just started about ecosystem service mapping, where we're trying to map lots of ecosystem services for Europe. And the real challenge, some services are relatively easy because they're based on a simple physical model. So for example, prevention of soil erosion occurring. You just find the right data, fit a model, and it's done. Some are much more contentious or involve process complexity, like hydrological functions, very hard. And some we just have to be very creative. So for example, we've just finished developing an algorithm for pollination service provision, which incorporates all the ecology of the system. We're also working on a measure of recreational amenity, a cultural service, by scripting, drawing down all the photos from Flickr that suggest that someone's been in the natural environment and found it charming, and then using information theoretic models to associate those with covariates, and then map the probability that someone might find a landscape to provide recreational amenity, and then how many people live within a travel cost and could be receiving that service. So this is a slightly long answer, but it's work in progress.
There's a question at the back.
This is another left question, sorry. Do you have any kind of confidence levels built into the maps that you produce? I mean, obviously some areas are going to be vastly better recorded than others, and you don't want to be saying with great confidence that one area is fine to destroy and then it turns out that actually it's missed something because it hasn't been recorded.
Well, that's a really good question again. I was showing you Left 1, which is our proof of concept tool that's live and working now as a sort of technology demonstration that people are using. We're working on Left 2, which incorporates a huge number of refinements. And the particular way we're addressing that question, how can I be sure that the biodiversity records you're retrieving for a given area and the downstream metrics you derive from this are good? We're addressing using species-area relationships. So for different major biomes of the world, forests, deserts, grasslands, and so on, we've queried our GBIF records with lots of different sized boxes, and to ask, what is the species-area relationship of GBIF records? So how many records would you expect to find in this broad ecosystem type for a query area of a given size? And we can then classify the records that get returned according to whether there are substantially more records than an average location in this biome of that size, substantially fewer or about average. And that can give the user some evidence to suggest that the results they're seeing are either based on very dense data about normal data or rather sparse data. But it's very hard to provide a very custom evaluation of model adequacy automatically on a case-by-case basis. So we have to automate to some degree.
I'm a planner, and English Heritage were taking photographs of historic buildings, which was an invitation to people to steal York stone fireplaces. Is there some data of rare, I'm thinking flora mainly, that is invitation to people coming to find the orchid before well, it's well established, and to plunder the landscape, to the environment.
Peter, can I take this one then? So, having worked at Kew and having been worrying about water lilies recently being stolen, that's one of the things that we do. Clearly, if you drill down, you will find the data eventually within the output. But this is the advantage of having these maps, which are basically are all of the evidence summed together. So it's quite hard to find the individual orchid. But at the end of the day, the data we're using is publicly available data. So GBIF in particular, the Global Biodiversity Informatics Database, you can go in and find that data anyway. So in a sense, by creating the maps, we're taking away some of that. It's not so straightforward or as easy as one would hope. But if somebody really wants to find that data, they're going to find it anyway, sadly. There was another question down here, I think.
Yeah, so I was wondering about these sampling biases that typically occur when you're evaluating species ranges or interpolating the species ranges. And there's some really interesting ideas about attaching them to birds or sampling using these sorts of methods. But I was wondering what you thought the future of cheap drones might be in terms of getting sampling in sort of an ideal situation.
So as my main research, I'm actually working with cheap drones to sample rainforests, and sort of the justification on my funding body is to sample disaster areas, but those are quite rare, unlike rainforests, which aren't. So there's a lot of future in it, basically. The reason we want to put the tags on the birds is because they're cheap, and that's a really quick way of getting going with a really large and long-range study, whereas the drones have quite limited ranges, and they're fairly expensive, and they require people to be there to deal with them. So the drones would be mainly for more detailed analysis of other species, like social networks of birds, and one of the amusing thought was hunting poachers or illegal loggers by detecting the fuel trails that they leave behind. So sorry, drones and mosquitoes, probably not, but we are doing a lot of work with drones for biodiversity.
I have a quick question about left. When I think of biodiversity, I also, of hotspots in biodiversity, I often come to think of coral reefs. And so does left have any sort of aquatic habitat component? And I don't even know how you would incorporate that. But
Well, it's a very easy question to answer, really. No, left is a terrestrial tool, but in principle, that the technology could be used to look at marine systems. We just haven't done it.
So I talked at the International Petroleum Association a couple of years ago, and that was the biggest question. The number of the oil mining engineers saying we can see from our satellite imagery that where the corals are, and why can't we have a tool like this which will give us the basics? And it's finding the funding. It comes down to that. It's finding people who actually want to put the funding into that. But it's a much bigger challenge because they're not, obviously we don't have the species occurrence data that we have for the terrestrial systems, and we don't really have these sort of habitat suitability models. There are a couple, but nothing like that's available for terrestrial. But I think that is a very obvious next step. There's another question.
Thank you. Thank you. So I've got a general question really about how we design tools to be for particular purposes, and there seems to be a great trade-off between designing a tool that's very general that answers some very broad questions, perhaps like LEF does, and some that are very specific and have to be contextualized, for example, which grid cell you're in and which birds you might like to see. And I wonder whether we can make any general statements about whether we're hitting the right audiences with our tools, and how we can judge whether we're getting better at that.
Well, I could start that one. I'm sure you'll have comments on this, but certainly for me, I think that we haven't been hitting the right audiences. And what makes me say that is the number of times I've been to meetings where you have the policymakers and you have the academics putting forward these really fantastic state-of-the-art tools, and you have the landowner in the room saying, how on earth am I supposed to use this? So this is sort of turning it around, saying, okay, let's get the landowners into the room and say, what do you want to know? Which is where I got that question, where can we damage? It is a hard question, but it's a very honest one, and to also understand how much time people have to try and extract data from things. So I think that, but there are different levels. If you've got someone doing very high level modelling and you've got someone in the government who really wants very high level output, that's a very different tool. But also they've got a different amount of money to put towards that tool. So I think I think more often enough we're missing off the people that really are doing the damage because we're not asking the right people the right questions. And I think that's where we need to be working. So with the Mosquito tool, I don't know, Tom, what do you think about this, the audience for this?
It depends particularly what type. So if we were doing the smoke alarm idea that I discussed, then there would obviously be quite a large audience for that. But I don't know, really. You want to make the tool as easy to use as possible and as easy to acquire as possible, because then people want to use it. And also on a more general statement is, rather than requiring people to give you data in a specific way, take data from them in the way they want to give it to you. So for example, as a different project I've been working on, we do animal welfare on farms. And asking farmers to perform statistics for us just doesn't happen. But asking farmers to post us the documents that they fill out anyway does happen. And so basically making it as easy as possible for people to do your work for you is one way to go ahead with it.
So we have a sort of technical expertise, or we know what sort of thing could perhaps be accomplished in a processing sense. But I spend a lot of my time, more than I'd perhaps like to, listening to people. So that means going and talking to Jimmy the farmer, or going to talk to politicians or NGOs or multinational businesses. And we have this general objective to provide decision support tools that help people make decisions about land. But we need to know what kind of decisions need to be made, what kind of people are making the decisions, under what circumstances, what sort of information they'd like provided to them, and how they'd like to engage with decision support tools on the internet. And those are very difficult questions because people often don't know what it is that they want until they see it. So it's very hard just to get someone to specify an ideal system. And we don't often understand the needs very well of the users. So it's a weird combination of marketing, if you like, in the sense of going out and finding out what would be necessary as a kind of product, and the engineering side behind the scenes as well.
I mean, the other point to make, I think, is that the necessity to hide the complexity behind the tool. So as an academic, you want to make the thing look really complicated. I think we probably all do. But as an end user, you don't want to. So effectively, that the art is to have all the really hard modelling, the maths behind the tool, and to have that interface as being as simple as possible. And every so often we have to check ourselves of what we've done with the interface, because we add in an extra button, think, oh, that's very helpful, and it's not helpful. It basically suddenly makes that tool almost unusable. So there's a very steep learning curve. I think the way you're trained as an academic is very, very different. And also your colleagues will look at you and say, why on earth are you doing something that looks so simple? And it's not till they understand the maths and the modelling behind it that they suddenly realise that there's a lot more to it than meets the eye. Yes.
Hi there. Yeah, another question for Left as well. I'm another planner, however, I'm one of the landowner side as well, a developer, and one of Britain's biggest landowners I work for. And just a comment in terms of the tool, it looks very useful. My first reaction is thinking that a law of unintended consequences in a way, that a developer will probably look at it and think, excellent, I can sack all my ecologists and my advisors and I can just go straight to the tool and get a nice map that I can put up and say that's my justification for why I'm developing in this particular area as well. So you're sort of getting rid of the professional advice element as well from there. And I wonder if that's a risk of the side as well. And the other thing you mentioned in terms of the cultural element of it as well there, that I'm wondering whether or not it's completely the opposite direction to the way you treat biodiversity. That if you've got somebody whose cultural appreciation is in a minority, and maybe there are not so many photographs of what they appreciate, their value and their side is not being represented.
Okay, that's a really good question. And we have a disclaimer on our tools that says these are not intended to substitute for expert field environmental impact assessment. The problem is that those environmental impact assessments aren't always done very well, and they always should begin with a desk study phase. And potentially, our sort of technologies can be very helpful at that stage by being a data discovery tool that puts the information that might conceivably be required at the fingertips of the person who's going to interpret it. Of course, you can't automatically collect high-quality data about every possible aspect of the environment, so sooner or later, you need to go and do a proper field survey. But this can act as a useful pre-planning or screening tool to distinguish and provide context before you go and do that. The second thing you asked is about sort of cultural appreciation is a tricky question. It's something that we worry about as we develop these algorithms. It's just a matter of being very, very careful about the way you process the data and trying to capture the full variety of it. So when we've been harvesting these photos, there's an astonishing variety of things people put on the internet. There's things in urban areas that don't concern us, but a lot of countryside photos are not of lovely birds and wildlife, but they're things like train spotters who put all these photos of steam engines. And you need to ask, is that part of the environment or something else entirely?
I ought to add, we did compare our outputs with 4 environmental impact assessments from the same areas, and we did some work with Unilever? Yes, Unilever in Turkey, where they sent one of their people out for 3 weeks, and then we compared our output with them. And we picked up quite a lot more than any of the environmental impact assessments did, because the impact assessments are not asking for the levels of scrutiny that this tool is pulling in. So I think, Unilever were impressed, but I don't think it does away with the people on the ground, but I think it makes sure that all the information is all as much as possible is at the fingertips. But,
Thank you. Sorry, to follow on from the point you think you're making just before that, the tool itself is open source, but are the algorithms behind it, are they accessible to anyone, or are they proprietary? And I suppose following on a little bit from the point the gentleman just made before is, in the wrong hands, is there a risk that this kind of tool could lead to more of a zonation approach to planning and biodiversity, and not so much integration?
If I can just say the second point first of all, we're heading that way anyway. Biodiversity offsetting is as close we're going to come to zonation. I think what we've developed is the first, so it is a pilot, it works anywhere in the world, but how people then use it is the point we step back, because I know, for example, that one of the oil companies uses out pixel values and divides it by barrels of oil. But that's the way that they have been given the right to convert that land. And so really it's the policies of that local government that we really need to then challenge and say, hang on a moment, but I don't think that's what we're trying to do, is get as much of the data out there as possible to make it as quantitative as possible. And we compared some of the other biodiversity tools out there right now. Will give you derived data, and they'll give you one layer of data. So I think, in a sense, this is so the algorithms themselves are, some of them are off the shelf, some of them are ones we've devised. They're all within the tool. The tool's wrapped up, and it's available.
I can say a little bit about the data policy. It's a decision support tool, so from a policy perspective, it's really out of our hands what people do with the data. We just have to speak truth into power. But in terms of data policy, the source data that we use deliberately is either in the public domain, such as satellite data, or it's data that we've received data sharing agreements with the data holders, and they entitle us to redistribute the data. So in terms of the raw data itself, it's in the public domain. The algorithms themselves, we're trying to be very transparent. So every algorithm implemented in our tools will be published, so it's transparent in that sense. Much of the software that's used to construct the tools is open source, mainly because we want to pay for it, and we want to have the flexibility and extensibility of using open source software. However, it costs us money to build these tools and make them available, and ultimately there is an aim to try and commercialize some of the tools. So we want to maintain database rights in the underlying databases we have that make the whole thing work and tie it together. So it's very difficult to both simultaneously use open source data and disseminate open source data whilst maintaining some control over the systems itself, and that's why we assert our intellectual property in the software glue and the databases that run the tools.
I think there's one more question at the back and then this one over there.
Hi, I just had a question about the cattle tags. Do they have an acoustic component? How do they work?
So the idea would be similar to the cicada detector, which was a iPhone-style microphone with an amplifier.
On the cattle tag?
Yes, yeah.
Because cows are so noisy.
Well, exactly.
You're going to get tons of background noise, and they lose their tags. And mosquitoes have a preferential biting rate. They tend to like their legs. They don't tend to go for their heads.
So maybe it should be an ankle bracelet.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Or implanted inside the cat.
And they like bash each other. So, I mean, you might have a lot of background noise in that.
Okay, yeah, no, it's something we should look at. This was an idea that came up in a research group discussion by a bunch of engineers a few weeks ago.
Yeah. No, I'm happy to talk to you more about that.
Yeah, no, it'd be great if you could.
So I think we've got time for one more question, and then I think we should wrap up. Chris.
Most of the environments that we deal with are subject to changes in time as well as in space. I wondered if you could make some comments about the accessibility of time series of data and how that might affect estimates of risk to developments that the sort that you were talking about.
Well, we're the long-term ecology lab, and long-term means lots of different timescales, from pollen cores going back thousands of years and to satellite data series in the recent past. And I should say that all the data that we're bringing in is time explicit, so we know when a biodiversity observation was made, and we know when a satellite data was collected and so on. So in left, the results pertain to the recent past, so we're essentially drawing in data from the last 10 years and trying to describe the situation about last year. Left 2 and EcoSet and NatureTrend, our forthcoming tools, are designed to be rolling in time, so that essentially they update themselves automatically. And the tool presents results about both the previous year and the last 3 months and sort of rolls on. So the models take account of time, that they explicitly tie the records themselves to the covariates that are linked in time. But also the tools are dynamic in time, in the sense that you can ask questions about different points in time, or at least in the next version of the tool you'll be able to.
Julian. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. That was fascinating. Just before we close, I'd like to tell you about some more events we've got coming up. In this series, the Changing Dynamics Between Man and Machine series, next week we have a talk on the ethics and laws of 21st century warfare about drone strikes. The following week is about trends and challenges for accurate indoor localization. That's about the issue of having sensors everywhere. And the last in the series goes a little way towards the unemployed ecologist question, which is about the challenges and opportunities of automation for the workforce, called Replaced by Robots, ? And 2 other events that aren't in any seminar series, but I hope will be of interest. This coming Monday, at 5 o'clock, Dr. Kumi Naidu, who's the Executive Director of Greenpeace International, will be here talking about direct action, when and why. You're all very welcome to come, 5 o'clock, and it will be followed by a drinks reception. And then to celebrate International Women's Day in March, on the 6th of March, we have Baroness Helena Kennedy, who will be talking about the fight for women's rights, learning from success. So those are just a few of the events we have coming up, and please do keep in touch with our website, because we have an ever-rolling and changing program of great lectures. So thank you very much. I'd like to just finish with a warm round of applause for our 4 speakers. Thank you.